Hi, welcome to the Indie Wine Podcast. My name is Matt Wood, and this is episode 28. Today we're talking about Angelo Pellegrini, the great Italian-American author. If you aren't familiar with the name, his books to me are classics of food and wine-based literature. If you enjoy the writings of MFK Fisher, Jacques Pépin, Julia Child, James Beard, etc., then these books are probably right up your alley, and they have a little bit more of a wine tilt to them also. Throughout, I have some short quotes from his books, but to really get the feel of his writing, you need to take the chapters in as a whole. Most of his books have relatively short chapters that you can pick up and read when you have a few minutes here and there. He captures the immigrant experience and a changing world, and the books are a wonderful read. Here we go. The Life of Angelo Pellegrini. Angelo Pellegrini was an Italian-American author and professor. Most of his 10 books deal with the immigrant experience of leaving a former life and country behind. But Pellegrini brought much of his old country life with him wherever he went. His writing style was conversational and often dealing with how you can make more of less. Cultivating a vegetable garden and fruit trees, transforming scraps and offcuts into delicacies, cooking simply and seasonally, making your own wine from carefully grown grapes, and tending to your relationships with family, friends, and fellow citizens. His writing about food and wine are really inspiring, and beyond his books, he helped to introduce regional Italian specialties like pesto to the United States. Angelo Pellegrini was born April 20th, 1903 in Casabianca, Italy, part of Tuscany and located near Florence. He was the eldest son and the third of 5 children to Annunziata and Piacentino Pellegrini. Piacentino, his father, had quit school by the age of 9, and the family lived a sharecropper's existence. A place to live and food for the table, but not much extra to go around. Life in Italy was hard during this time. Italy had recently been unified as a country after millennia of states, and regionalism ran strong. Respect for the government was low as debt mounted and poverty, especially in the South, took hold. Many couldn't vote, and some of those that could were ordered not to by the church, which had lost a lot of its land, such as Rome and the Papal States during unification, and so refused to recognize the government. With the government becoming more authoritarian and people dying of hunger, an Italian-American who was born in Tuscany also, but had immigrated to New Jersey, returned to his land of birth to assassinate King Umberto, Italy's second ruler, in 1900. This is the Italy Angelo was born into, and sharecropping would have been in his future. Even at the age of 7, he had been hired out for day wages. Leaving home early in the morning, barefoot and in short pants to break up dirt clods in a field or shoveling sand from a riverbed. The central, dominating fact of our existence was continuous, inadequately rewarded labor. A neighbor of the family had made the trip to the United States previously and returned with enough money to purchase his home and his land. L'Americano, as he was called, also had enough to loan Piacentino money for a ticket. Leaving Casabianca and the 5 children, aged 2 through 14, and sailing to New York on a steamship in 1912, he knew nobody when the ship docked in New York. Eventually, he landed a gig as part of an extra gang for the Northern Pacific Railroad. They would be sent wherever extra men were needed. Piacentino was sent to Washington, 7,000 miles away from his wife and children. A chance encounter with a Scandinavian immigrant named Sistrom changed his life. Sistrom was a section foreman for the Henry McCleary Timber Company. The two hit it off immediately. Complete opposites in personality and physical attributes, both speaking a bizarre version of English and best friends. Within a year of joining, Piacentino became Sistrom's assistant in constructing and maintaining 20 miles of railroad for the timber operation, right as it was expanding. Soon enough, he was able to send for the rest of his family. In 1913, they loaded onto the Taormina, sailing from Genoa, Italy aboard the 482-foot ship. The crossing taking 19 days in the packed conditions of steerage with scores of other Italian immigrants. The ship had recently been retrofitted to hold 180 passengers, up from the original 120. Most of these were from southern Italy. There were many more just like them. Between 1880 and 1924, more than 4 million Italians immigrated to the United States. Taking the passage across the Atlantic, rough, frightening, and exhausting, where the smell of vomit mingled with the odor of boiling cod in the galley, according to Angelo. Waiting 3 days at Ellis Island, they finally made it through the examinations and were admitted into America. The Tuscan dialect is at the base of the official Italian language, and McCleary is not a word that rolls off the tongue of newly landed immigrants. Despite their pleas, nobody could figure out where this family was headed. Finally, Washington was recognized by a railroad agent, and the family were off on the 6-day trip to Yakima. McCleary is pretty far to the west, and Yakima is in central Washington, so they were still quite a ways away from where they were trying to get. That is, until they heard Italian being spoken. Carlo Bianconi had worked in McCleary and knew Piacentino. After a filling breakfast of potatoes, ham, eggs, and coffee, they were off to reunite. Logging and milling and the related industries dominated McCleary, what Pellegrini called a typical company town. Most of the population was filled with Italian, Greek, Scandinavian, or Irish immigrants. They were at their new home. Angelo was 10 when they arrived, but would start in the first grade because he didn't know any English. His teacher, sensing that he was a quick learner, good kid, and smart, began tutoring him, and before he knew it, he was with kids his own age, finishing school up to 8th grade in only 5 years. He was winning spelling bees and improving his reading by translating newspaper articles for his parents. After 8th grade, Angelo got his first job in the United States, patching tracks and doing repairs for the Northern Pacific Railroad like his father used to do. His father had expected that things would be done like they were in the old country, and that Angelo was more than old enough to be a working man. But Angelo wasn't done with school yet. There was no high school in their small town. He was earning money to pay for a bus pass for his commute to high school 10 miles away. Graduating in 3 years, he played sports, but also excelled in debate and writing. By 1922, he was enrolled at the University of Washington as a history major before switching to law and majoring in that for 2 years, graduating in 1927. In the end, language won out, and he became a professor at a nearby college before eventually returning to the University of Washington, where he would remain for 43 years. In 1942, while a professor at the school, he earned his Ph.D., meeting his future wife Virginia in the process. Some of his first published writings were for Sunset Magazine, the classic West Coast living magazine and themed cookbook publisher. A couple other recipes are still my go-to for certain dishes. In 1946, they published Pellegrini's recipe for pesto, the first published recipe for it in America. The inexact measurements are a hallmark of any Pellegrini recipe. They are all based on cooking, not following a recipe. Its only disadvantage is that it may unduly whet the appetite, he wrote. The Unprejudiced Palate, his first book, came out in 1948. It's considered a classic and is one of my favorite food books ever. Food and wine are present on nearly every page. There are dozens of recipes, but none of them formal. Pellegrini believing, culinary ideas are best conceived while one is surveying and hunger the raw materials with which he must prepare dinner. The food prepared is simple, unfussy, and seasonal. Ways to prepare red snapper, meatballs, risotto, artichokes, salad with vinaigrette, and of course lots of homemade bread and wine, also preferably homemade. Chapters filled with anecdotes, how to find a good meal in a town without good restaurants, ways to get the best steaks from your butcher, the abundance he experienced in America, and stories of his peasant father eating quail at his rich boss's home, and odd jobs and tasks young Angelo had fill the book. Adventures in winemaking pop up too, from watching his father's barrel of Vincento as a child to all the reasons why you should make wine every year, and also instructions, as vague as the other recipes. His opinions are strong throughout all his writings. Wine and the Good Life is filled with anecdotes about wine as food, sharing wine with friends and family, and his recipes for wine. Hence, strictly speaking, there is no recipe for wine. It makes itself. Like many of his books, the chapters are on the shorter side, and it's easy to pick it up and read a chapter or two, coming back to the book as you have time. He writes about introducing new converts to his so-called sinning ways. To induce between them and the wine the most ultimate rapport, I once again pulled the bung from the barrel. This time, I would siphon the Zinfandel directly into their glasses. They laughed and joked as we stooped low, they holding their glasses ready and I sucking on the siphon hose to start the flow. Isn't this exciting? Ah, do you find it so? The Zinfandel, a scant 10 months old, glowed brilliantly in their glasses. The Food Lover's Garden in 1970 delves into planning and planting a culinary garden to be used year-round. Sunset Magazine at one point even sent photographers to Pellegrini's home to photograph his gardens during every season of the year. Suggestions of how many tomatoes, zucchini, or beets you should plant and when. How to rotate your garden, care for the soil, and create the best compost. And he talks about rosemary. And there are other uses for the herb that grows so luxuriantly in the hills along the Mediterranean coast and elsewhere in the temperate zone where there is some sun. It's an ingredient in many sauces along with parsley, sage, garlic, shallots. I remember that fresh, tender rosemary leaves were scattered on the surface of chestnut cake, a sweet I relished and ate so greedily when I was a child in Italy. And I remember that the minced leaves were usually worked into the dough of panini, the tiny loaves my mother usually made when she baked bread. Once rosemary is growing in the garden, the curious and resourceful cook will discover for himself the many ways in which it may be used. We must take the cheese in tiny bites because there is so little of it. Pellegrini's next book in 1983 begins with this incantation he would hear daily in his childhood home of Casabianca. Lean years, happy years. Food was always precious, as were any natural resources. Recounting how he would see imperfect trees burned as fuel at the logging camps, and offcuts constantly sent to a forever burning bonfire, days, weeks, months, years of burning wood that had to have some other use besides waste. Pellegrini attempts to counteract this waste of natural resources and money. The book is divided into 3 parts: the garden, the kitchen, the cellar. The garden, imploring everyone to plant a garden in order to have more control over their meals and save money in the process. A productive kitchen garden requires no special talent, and ponder values that cannot be expressed in dollars and cents. A dissertation on cardoons and artichokes and how much garlic and green onions to plant follows. And now a further note on shrewd utilization of space. When I put the bean seeds in the ground in 2 parallel rows 3 feet apart, the space needed for their luxuriant growth, I sowed turnips and spinach, a 15-foot row of each between them. Grow your own, cook your own, make your own wine, begins the kitchen chapter, and more simple and economical recipes follow. Most using fresh herbs, lemons, and olive oil. He encourages substitutions and riffing. No beef? Use eggs. No beets? Use carrots. Italian battuto and sofrito make an appearance, as do mushrooms. Making fresh bread and using some of that dough for pizza is advised. Recipes and advice for many pasta dishes and themes, not recipes, are also included. You will not find the above recipe nor any of the others given thus far in the cookbooks, for they are not taken from the books on cookery. They derive from my variations on the regional cuisine of Tuscan Italy. Some of my recipes have been and continue to be simply suggested by the culinary resources of my kitchen garden. We get to the cellar chapter, and his writing starts with backgrounds of wine and grapes and references for the first-timer. Tips on barrel care, sulfur usage, fermentation and pressing decisions, aging and keeping a clean cellar follow. The drawing of the wine and the pressing of the pomace, the svenatura, are a simple but slow-paced procedure. It is also a gay affair. Using a colander, remove the pomace to the wine press and slowly apply the pressure. The flow will initially be gushing since the pomace is saturated with wine. As it diminishes and becomes a trickle, apply more pressure. Continue in this manner, giving each turn of the screw enough time to do its work. And when you feel that what wine is reasonably recovered has been recovered, empty the press and repeat the process. Do not hurry. What in the nature of things can't be hurried? It's an inspiring book all around. Makes you feel like you can grow anything or cook anything. Not all of his books deal directly with food and wine. The experience of being an immigrant in middle 1900s America make up a large portion of his writings also. Immigrant's Return, American Dream, An Immigrant's Quest, and Americans by Choice are sometimes biographical, sometimes character studies of what he called an aesthetic rather than statistical, sociological, or economic. Here he is writing about the American dream in 1951. What then of the dream in our and future generations? Is it myth or reality? Such dreams as Rockefeller indulged in are now out of the question. Considering the continuing depletion of the planet's major resource systems, wisdom requires us to dream of ways of conserving rather than exploiting what remains of our natural endowment. This is not only a matter of declared national policy, but it also ought to be the concern of every individual. One who, in his personal design for living, avoids waste, extravagance, conspicuous consumption, quite independently of what the community may require, is a true conservationist. In American Dream, he tells the story of him briefly joining the Communist Party in the 1930s and how on April 23, 1948, it came back to haunt him when he was called in front of Washington's Committee of Un-American Activities, also called the Canwell Committee. He had joined looking for answers to the widespread despair and suffering during the Great Depression. Bread lines while food was being destroyed, discrimination against immigrants, and property rights always winning out against human rights. Refusing to name others he knew while in the party, despite being told he could go free if he did, Pellegrini was taking chances with his career and life. The Unprejudiced Palate was set to be published, and he was up for a Guggenheim Fellowship as well. He held his tongue and was told he would be called back later, but the committee took a recess and never reassembled. His first book was published, and his fellowship to study abroad was granted, yielding An Immigrant's Return and his first trip back to Italy since he left as a boy. Years later, he received an award from the Washington House of Representatives for Outstanding Citizen of Washington State. Pellegrini would often make his wine from California grapes, Sonoma, Santa Clara, and Napa being his favorites. For years, the Mondavi family would send over a ton of grapes to Angelo, mostly Cabernet it seems. His barrels were previously used by the winery also. Sometimes he got beans too, not just any beans. Angelo's favorite, the Monachine. Robert Mondavi's uncle supplied the first batch of Little Nuns to Robert, who then supplied Pellegrini in the 50s. The bean's named because of the white cap on the black beans. It's a pole bean that you can eat fresh or dried. His favorite way was to smash one and dip it in some good olive oil. Brent Pellegrini, Angelo's son, gave the Herb Farm restaurant some of the beans in 2008. He had taken care of them since Angelo passed away. They carefully cultivated this bean that over the previous 60 years had honed itself to this environment. By 2013, they were able to put in over 1,000 plants, as well as passing seeds to other friends. The Organic Seed Alliance tested the bean's genetics. No matches were found. The bean is now commonly called the Pellegrini bean. Pellegrini retired from teaching in 1973, although he maintained an office at the University of Washington until shortly before his death. He would write there many days. Ruth Reichel selected and wrote the foreword for the reprinting of his classic, The Unprejudiced Palate, in 2005, calling him a slow food voice in a fast food nation. His last book, Vintage Pellegrini, was finished shortly before he passed away. It contains chapters from most of his great works, as well as new writings and excerpts of his columns from the Seattle Weekly about a particular dish or ingredient. Like mushrooms. Autumn. The melancholy days are here again. The saddest of the year. Days of the fall leaf. Reminder of one's mortality. So much for the poet. It is also the season of the apple, the pear, the grape, the fig, and the mushroom. Angelo Pellegrini passed away from cancer on November 1st, 1991, at the age of 88. Thanks for listening today. Hopefully it's an introduction to Pellegrini for some and a reminder of him for others. Although some of his books are out of print, The Unprejudiced Palate is pretty easy to find, and a lot of the books can be found pretty cheaply on Abe Books also, if you're okay with a used version. Harvest is still moving along in California. In fact, it's just getting started for some, and others are still waiting for it to start. I do have some great guests lined up once harvest quiets down a little, though. I think you'll enjoy them. You can follow the podcast on wherever you're listening and the Instagram at IndieWinePodcast. Feel free to email indiewinepodcast@gmail.com with comments, questions, or feedback. If you can tell your wine friends about the podcast too and help spread the word, I'd really appreciate it. Rating or subscribing helps too. There is also now a Patreon set up if you feel like supporting the podcast monetarily to hopefully allow for more episodes, more travel, and to help defray other costs. The link is in the show notes. We'll be back soon with another episode. Have a good one.